They made Han buy a speeder. Jubilar wasn't big on rentals. Too frequently, the rentals and/or the renters didn't come back. In early twilight, Han pulled the speeder to a stop at the address they'd given him and got out to look around. Almost 30 years. He felt so odd. Everything had changed. Places that he remembered as well-kept buildings had grown run down. Places that used to be run down had been torn down and new buildings built in their steads. Slums had spread everywhere. The planet's never-ending battles had razed entire neighborhoods. The neighborhood surrounding the Victory Forum, where Han had fought in the regional sector number 4's all-human free-for-all extravaganza, was a blasted ruin. It looked like the remains of some ancient civilization worn down by the eons. The small buildings surrounding the forum had their windows broken out and boarded up. Flame and shells and blaster fire had scored them. All that remained of the forum itself was broken rubble strewn across a huge empty lot. Han stepped off the sidewalk into the lot. Glass and gravel crunched beneath his feet as he walked across it toward the main entrance. He stood in the empty lot, staring at the desolation with a cool wind tugging at him. And suddenly it struck him as though he were there that moment all those years ago, standing in the ring, facing the opponents with the screams and the cheers and the taunts of the crowd in his ears. His heart pounding, his breath coming short as the match flag flattered down toward the ground, and the other three fighters came at him. He took a running leap at the nearest. He got up 2 meters off the ground and landed a flying kick into the face of the onrushing first fighter. The man's nose broke, his head snapped back. To this day, Han had no clear memory of the next several minutes. They had recorded the fights and he had seen the recording, but the knowledge of what had happened did not connect to his blurred memories of the events themselves. The boy had been hurt, and hurt badly, walking off the mat with a broken arm and a broken jaw, 2 broken ribs, and a concussion and bruises across half his body. The bruises turned purple the next day. The woman who'd cared for Han the next several days, he couldn't even remember what she'd looked like. She was a strange one, and he remembered her running her fingers over the bruises, plainly fascinated. Here, here, right about here. Han stood on the spot. This empty place, this was the spot. The ring, and when all was done, he'd been the last one left on his feet. 30 years. Over half his life had passed since that day. Han took a slow step, stopped and took one last look around at the devastation, a ruin stretching to the horizon, and turned away and walked back to the speeder, and sat motionlessly in the speeder, leaning back with his hands clasped behind his head, staring up at the sky as darkness fell around him, remembering. Mayor Baker, Han said. A real pleasure. He'd met her in a brightly lit hydroponics warehouse, in a complex of warehouses at the edge of death, in the part of death they'd used to call Executioner's Row. He'd come prepared. He was visibly armed with a blaster, had a couple of holdout blasters tucked inside his coat, and a third down his boot. Not that he expected any trouble. This was business, a business he'd been in for a long time before the rebellion, and he knew what he was doing. But no point in taking chances on a planet like Jubilar, in a city like Death. They wanted him to smuggle Jandara to Shalam. Han had almost laughed aloud when the mayor's representative had approached him. Jandara was one of Leia's favorite treats. He expected that even she would be amused when he showed up on Shalam with a cargo full of it. And certainly the Shalamites wouldn't dare prosecute him over it. The mayor smiled at Solo. She was a tall, obese woman with features that did not take to a smile very easily. 4 bodyguards were present, 2 at the entrance of the warehouse, 2 a few steps behind the mayor, all armed with assault rifles. Gentleman Morgavi. Uh, Luke, is it? Han smiled at her. That's right, Luke Morgavi. As I told your aide, ma'am, I'm an independent trader out of Baranda. She nodded. A pleasure, Luke. Please, follow me. She led him down through rows of hydroponic tanks to a row toward the back where the growing lights were both brighter and of a different wavelength. Inside the tanks, small purple and green tubular vegetables grew. Gandara, she said. They're native to Jubilar. They're a great delicacy, and they usually only grow in the desert after relatively rare rainstorms. After almost 2 years of work, we managed to cultivate them. Han nodded. And the Shalomite slapped a 100% tariff on you. Anger touched her voice. We have 80,000 credits worth of Jandara here that are only worth 40,000 after the Shalomite tariff. Those Shalomites, Han commiserated. Can't trust them. They cheat at cards, too. Did you know that? She stopped and studied Han. No, Gentleman Morgavi. I did not. You cheat at cards, she thought, and kept this pleasant smile on her face. It was hard work. He really didn't recognize her. Well, 30 years was a long time after all, and she'd put on 60 kilos. And her last name, back then, before her marriage to the unfortunate Miyagi Baker, had been Incavi Larado. He'd said he'd come back, and here he was, the New Republic's infamous General Solo, and only 30 years late. 80,000 credits worth, she said again, delivered to Shalomite. That's a 40,000 upside, and we'd be willing to go 50%, Han said politely. Which would be 20,000 credits, and I'd be happy to make the run for that amount. Her eyes narrowed. You think you can get past the Shalomite Navy? Han said, Lady, I used to run the Imperial lines. I'm talking about the old Star Destroyers. Let me tell you a story. Out in the darkness, Boba Fett lay on his stomach, carefully adjusting his aim. He had to shoot in through the main entrance to the hydroponics warehouse, which wouldn't have been difficult except that some of the tanks were in his way. He was going to have to wait for Solo to come back out towards the warehouse entrance. Fett waited patiently. He was surprised by his good fortune. Who would have thought that a trap he had set 3 decades ago would come to fruition now? Good fortune indeed. Even today, with the Empire fallen, Han Solo had lots of enemies. Jabba's relatives, loyal officers of the Empire who'd managed to maintain small fiefdoms on 1,000 planets across the galaxy, and the various bounties on Solo, dead or alive, were still imperative. Even with Vader and Jabba and the Empire long gone, still worth making an effort for, even with 4.5 million credits in the bank. Oddly enough, the sight of Solo, looking at him through the rifle scope, filled Fett with a nostalgia that surprised him. There was no question in Fett's mind that Solo was a bad man, worse in every way that counted than the butcher of Montelian Zerat. And if that bounty had brought Fett no joy, he had handed the butcher over to his executioners with little enough in the way of regret. Solo, though. It came to Fett as a revelation that Solo's presence over the course of the decades had, in a way, been oddly comforting. He had been a part, however peripherally, of Fett's life for so long that Fett had difficulty picturing a world without him. The world had changed, and only Solo had remained a constant. He'd hunted Solo for various clients, various bounties. Fett had difficulty picturing a world without Solo. He leaned in and touched the scope's focusing ring. Solo's image and that of the woman Fett assumed was Incavilarado, though he did not recognize her, leapt into sharp relief, and Fett's finger tightened on the trigger. He wouldn't make the mistake of trying to take Solo alive. Not again. And he would learn to picture a world without him. They headed towards the entrance together, Mayor Incavi Baker smiling patiently, and with a certain effort that Han did not miss. He stayed a half a step behind her as she walked, keeping part of her bulk between him and the loading docks outside, where the lights had gone out not long after they had all entered the warehouse together. The loading docks outside were pitch black. Might have assembled an army for all Han knew. So this kid, said Han, his name was, Maris, and this old guy with delusions, Jocko. Yeah, anyway, this Jocko guy, he thinks he's a Jedi Knight. And let me tell you, that old guy with his delusions, he was a pain in the butt. Anyway, they tell me they have to get past the Imperial lines. What did they have waiting for him out there? What had he walked into? He knows something's wrong. That thought. He's... The main power line entered the warehouse at the northeast and split. One bundle running up to the ceiling and the overhead lights, and another bundle running back toward the hydroponics tanks. Han cocked his wrist a certain way, and the holdout blaster in his left sleeve dropped into his hand. Boba Fett had the crosshairs hovering just to the left of Inkavi Baker's approaching form. The crosshair found Solo's breast, lost it, found it again. Fett squeezed the trigger. The warehouse lights died. The blaster bolt tore through the darkness like a flash of lightning. Han hit the ground rolling, sparks still trailing away from the spot where his first shot had struck the power cable, rolling away, firing left-handed at the locations where he remembered the two closer bodyguards standing, pulling his blaster free right-handed. Screams. The woman was screaming, and he got off 4 shots with the holdout before it malfunctioned. Burning out, the power supply flashing hot and terribly bright as it went, lighting Han as a target to the world, and Han came up out of his roll and made it to his feet and ran backward through the darkness, through the rows of hydroponics tanks, spots dancing in his eyes, using his scalded left hand on the sides of the tanks to guide himself as blaster bolts rained around him. In that single flash, as the holdout blaster had arced out, he had seen a shape running toward the warehouse entrance. A shape out of Han Solo's nightmares. A shape out of the galaxy's darkest history. A man in Mandalorian combat armor. Inkavi Baker lay on her back, staring up into infinity. There was a terrible pain in her side, and she knew she was dying. She wished it weren't so dark. Bright lights flashed around her, blaster bolts that lit the world up briefly. But even the blaster bolts were fading now. A figure loomed up out of the darkness, knelt beside her, a man in gray armor. Inkavi opened her mouth, but nothing came, and the man reached for her. Something sharp and cold touched her neck. Gradually, the pain went away. A ringing in his ears. The 4 bodyguards were dead. Solo must have killed one off to the side, Fett thought, curled up around whatever wound Solo had left in him. Fett knew he had only killed the 3 who were standing when he entered the warehouse, and that had been as much a reflex as anything. But he knelt beside the woman, holding her hand until her thrashing stopped. In all his years as a bounty hunter, he had never killed the wrong target before. And there was a tightness in his throat he hadn't felt since the day of his exile from Concord Dawn. He felt an absurd desire to apologize to the woman, which was ridiculous. She was as guilty as sin as any human being had ever been in the history of time. Fett had known her in her earlier days, and there was nothing worthwhile in her or in her life. And certainly the galaxy would not miss her presence. But he had not meant to kill her. She shuddered slightly as her hand, holding his, went limp. The macrobinoculars buried in his helmet didn't help much, not in this darkness. They showed the still warm forms of 4 bodyguards and the bulk of this dead old woman. They showed the heat still emanating from the lamp fixtures that were now without power. Toward the back of the warehouse, a heat source moved. Fett came to his feet, rifle in hand, and went hunting. Mandalorian combat armor. I didn't come prepared for this, Han thought. He had an assault rifle taken from the bodyguard he'd kicked in the groin, but that wasn't going to help so much unless he got in close to Fett. And that was going to be hard, with the macro binoculars in Fett's helmet. He had to get out of this darkened warehouse, out into the night where there were places to run and places to hide, and try to reach the speeder he'd come here in. Han couldn't believe this was happening to him. He gathered his legs up beneath him, checked the safety on the assault rifle. He heard movement, out towards the front of the warehouse. Careful and quick, he kept his head down and ran in a crouch toward the warehouse's rear entrance. Lando would be jealous if Han made it back to tell him about it, and if Lando made it back to be told. Leia was going to be furious. Fett ducked down behind one of the growing tanks, unlimbered his flare gun, and fired a shot towards the warehouse's roof. Actinic orange light flared. It would give Solo some light to work with. The interior of the warehouse became bright as day, and huge wavering shadows struck away from the warehouse's supporting beams as the flare hit the ceiling, crawled along it for several seconds, and started to descend. Something rattled off at the eastern end of the warehouse. Fett held his position, held his fire. Solo had thrown something. The sound came again. Patience. Patience. A single shot, the sound of broken glass. That was Solo making an exit for himself through one of the windows, before the flare faded, while he could still see to run. And Fett surged to his feet to shoot Solo down as he made for the broken window. He had time to see Solo standing 50 meters away, pointing one of the bodyguard's assault rifles at him. The shot took Fett in the breastplate and blew him off his feet. Han Solo turned and ran, hit the shattered window and dove through it like a young man in his prime. Boba Fett rolled over, staggered back to his feet only a second later. The breastplate of his combat armor so hot it burned everywhere it touched him, and in a murderous rage charged after Solo, as unaware of the pain that throbbed in his legs and chest as if it belonged to someone else. Han ran towards his speeder under the dim light from the planet's only moon. He was slightly disoriented. He couldn't remember whether the down lot where he'd left the speeder was south and west, or south and east. He ran south down one of the long alleyways between the warehouses, breath coming short, and came up to the last building, the last cover before the down lot, and hesitated before rounding the corner. The down lot was either immediately to his left or immediately to his right. He tried to envision the layout of the warehouse park in his mind. He thought he'd come the quick way around, but maybe not. And if he hadn't, then Fett might have reached the down lot before him. A scraping sound, metal on stone. Before he even realized what he was doing, Han found himself rounding the corner, rifle up, and finger tightening on the trigger as Boba Fett was turning toward him, bringing up his own rifle. They stood there in the middle of nowhere, on a planet the rest of the galaxy had more than half forgotten, pointing assault rifles at one another from a distance of less than a meter. Han didn't fire. Fett didn't fire. Bizarre details piled in on Han. The aperture of Fett's assault rifle was huge, as big as the Death Star had seemed at first sight. The barrel wasn't perfectly steady. It wavered slightly, moving around almost in invisibly tiny circles. The moonlight glinted off of Fett's scarred armor. Han could see the moon reflect darkly on the black visor. He was still out of breath from the running. His voice caught when he spoke. I guess we're going to die together. Fett's voice as harsh and raw as ever.
Evidently.
Han stared over the sight at him. Your armor won't save you. Not at this range.
No.
I doubt you can kill me quick enough to keep me from firing. Fett's helmet moved slightly. A nod.
I doubt it too.
Han did not dare take his eye away from his rifle's sight, aiming at the base of Fett's throat. You killed those people back there. The woman. Han could have sworn he saw a shiver run up the bounty hunter's frame.
I'm sorry about that. She was not the target.
Han almost pulled the trigger on him. He could hear the rage in his own voice. You're going to die, and I'm going to die. And maybe we both deserve it. That woman didn't do any.
She's the one who called me.
Han took a step forward and screamed, I don't care! He found to his amazement that he was standing with the barrel of his rifle jammed up against Fett's armor. That the barrel of Fett's rifle was digging into his own breastbone. I don't know what made you like you are. You think you get to decide who lives and who dies. I don't care. Come on! Pull the trigger and we'll die together. He stared into the black visor. Last decision you'll ever get to make. Boba Fett said in a voice so soft that Han would have sworn it could not have been Fett's.
You first.
His voice got even softer, amazingly.
You're married, aren't you? You have children who need you. What were you doing out here solo? Pretending to be young again? This is no place.
The fury that touched Han was bone deep. Don't you talk about my children. I'll kill you so fast.
Do you want to die?
Han took a deep breath. Do you? Fett shook his head, the tiniest possible movement of the visor.
No, but I do not see a way out.
The faintest breath of hope touched Han. All right. You put down your rifle. I won't kill you if you put down your rifle. Fett whispered it.
No. You put down yours. I won't kill you if you put down yours. I'll let you go back to your family, unharmed.
I don't trust you.
Nor I, said Fett. You.
A cool wind blew across the downlot. Han felt it drying his sweat, chilling him. We take 5 steps back, Han said finally. You drop your rifle and you run like a gun dark on fire. Even if I do shoot at you, that armor would protect you.
I have bad legs. I don't think I can outrun you.
Han could not stop thinking of his children. Of Leia. Just walk away. Put the rifle down and walk away. I'm an honest man. I won't kill you.
You're a liar,
said Fett.
By all evidence. I think you would.
Fett paused.
When I was a young man,
he said finally,
I think I would have pulled the trigger by now. But I find I do not hate you, and I am not ready to die to remove you from the world.
I made a mistake coming here to Jubilar. I do hate you. I hate everything you've done. But my wife and my children need me.
I don't see a way out of this,
said Fett.
That does not involve trying to trust one another.
This rifle's getting heavy, said Han, which it was. He watched Fett over the sight. What are we going to do?
Everyone dies,
said Fett. Yeah, eventually. But it doesn't have to be today. Not for either of us. Fett shook his head. The helmet barely moved, and Han did not imagine that Fett's attention had shifted even slightly.
I do not know,
Fett said softly.
Trust is hard among enemies. Perhaps we should return to the battle. Perhaps, Han Solo, we should let fly, and once more let fate decide who will survive, as we did when we were young.